Hello and welcome to the 905er podcast. I'm Roland Tanner.
I am Joel McLeod.
This week we're joined by Glyn Bowerman of the Spacing Radio podcast. Spacing is something special and increasingly rare, a quarterly magazine printed on paper, but it's also an important website and a highly recommended and interesting monthly podcast. In all its formats, Spacing exists specifically to discuss and promote ideas and discussion relating to urbanism in Canada's cities. And Glyn is specifically the voice and presenter of the Spacing Radio podcast. Now, although it looks especially at urban issues in Canada's big cities, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Ottawa, and Edmonton, it also explores many issues which are extremely familiar to everybody living in the 905 region. So welcome Glyn Bowerman from Spacing Magazine to the 905 podcast. Welcome, Glyn.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Joel.
And I thought we could kick off just for those listeners who probably are not familiar with Spacing and Spacing Magazine and the Spacing podcast. Can you just describe who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, I started with Spacing Magazine, which is a quarterly Canadian urbanism magazine. It's been going on over 15 years now. And I am in charge of the podcast. We do monthly podcasts along the same themes. So, urban planning, transit design, social issues, police reform, all of that stuff kind of rolled into one. And we do try to cover, cities across Canada, but we are based in Toronto, and unfortunately, it is hard to comment about things outside of the black hole that is Toronto.
Your words, not ours.
Well, I mean, there's definitely, I've been aware of Spacing for quite a long time now, and there's definitely a lot of overlap between what you do and what we do, and big fans of your work. And to an extent, we came into existence just because of that kind of the suburban angle that has its own challenges and difficulties, and we'll come on to it over this interview, I'm sure. But certainly part of that, our kind of inspiration was some of the work that you've been doing with Spacing. Now, and really, again, when you talk about urbanism and really advocating for better cities, do you find a lot of our podcasts, we worry that they come across very negative, because it always seems that the good things that we want to happen in terms of walkable communities, cyclable communities, less car dependence, more density, but done in a kind of intelligent and healthy way. We seem to be losing so many battles all the time rather than winning them. And do you feel that over the 15 years that Spacing has been in existence, that progress is actually being made in a good direction?
That's difficult to say. When the Spacing magazine started, well before my time there, I think the general idea was to find things to celebrate about cities and in the field of urbanism. It was an optimistic time. It was, David Miller was the mayor. There was just a lot of creative, progressive thinking and fresh ideas coming into the city. And it seemed like the political will and the money to make some of that happen. I joined this whole kind of foray into urbanism out of journalism school in the Rob Ford mayoral years. So I came from more of the view of like, this is broken and we need to fix it, rather than let's celebrate some of the amazing things that are being done. So I try not to, but especially in recent years, months, whatever, it's hard to not take a dim view, especially when we keep making the same mistakes, and not just in Toronto, like Canadian cities all over the world in North America. We know their mistakes and we make them anyway.
Coming off of this recent provincial election, the idea of development and construction. That was kind of a central theme for some of this election, I thought. Now, I'm not going to ask you to go into the various party platforms and whatnot, but I just thought, do you get the sense that people are taking a newer or more proactive view of this this issue in terms of what they want their communities and their cities and their neighborhoods to start looking like than they did before?
I'd like to think that at least city planners in the various GTHA communities, they seem to all get it for the most part, and I think it was encouraging that when Doug Ford first came to power, 4 years ago, and there were rumors that the green belt would be somehow threatened, that there was pushback from a lot of people, and even amongst older conservatives. I think the sense is that the green belt is something that should be protected. So I guess that's something to take heart in. In terms of things like single family zoning, that kind of thing, I think it really depends which side of your bread is buttered. There's a contingency of people that don't want to see change and will fight against anything that whiffs of it. And then there's a lot more people who are just trying to get a foothold, be it the ability to buy a house or just be able to afford a safe and decent apartment building, something like that. I think there's a lot more of those people just trying to find some stability in a very unstable housing market than there are these, powerful homeowners who have a sort of outsized influence politically.
We were just discussing before we came online how, well, it's kind of my experience anyway in 2018 of running in an election, and how the conventional advice to people canvassing in municipal politics is don't bother with apartment blocks because you're wasting your time, because right. they I live in an apartment now. I just want to point that out. But they don't vote, and what was true was they were very often not on the voters list, because the municipal the body then in control of building the voters list, which was not Elections Ontario, did such a bad job that the entire apartment buildings were just completely missed from. Now that doesn't stop people from voting, but it just adds another barrier. And so the single family neighborhoods do have a kind of disproportionate power, because they're the ones that basically decide who sits on council very often. It seems to me. Is that an impression you would share?
Oh, absolutely. And it's I wonder how much of the idea that people in apartments don't vote or renters don't vote, to a certain extent, they're not officially, but they're sort of quietly, unofficially discouraged from participating. That they don't have the right. And I think we treat property ownership as if that you kind of bought the right when you bought your house to have your sway over things. And this idea of like, not only did I buy a house, I bought the neighborhood. And so it's not enough to have say over my own property that I own, but I also want to say over who lives next door to me and who lives down the block and how high things are across the street from me. And I think that's pretty ridiculous for a city like Toronto. And I think as the 905 individual cities get more dense or require more density, it becomes increasingly ridiculous to push back against those things as well there.
Kind of looking into the future now, because you're talking about as the 905 changes, there right now there's a lot of talk. People are very much concerned about their mortgage payments. They're worried about in 5 years whether or not their housing will become affordable, so to speak. And combine that with the recent talk, we need to build more living units to put on the market to help bring down the price of housing and what have you. What do you think we're looking into in terms of maybe a new? Are we? Is it possible that we're actually going to look into new ways of designing the Canadian city? Because for a while, especially out here in the 905, it was always just keep building a new subdivision, right? That
Yeah.
field over there, we can just put a new subdivision there, put a strip mall, and then look past to the next field. But I'm getting the sense that need is going to change. Just kind of market demand almost is going to force that change into, as we were saying, more dense living, more apartment buildings, if you will. Hopefully, what's your take on that? Am I reading too much into the tea leaves on this one?
I mean, I'm not a housing expert or an analyst of that kind of thing, but it does seem to me that the idea that you can sort of buy early and buy low, and that's kind of your retirement policy, or you're going to cash out big when you're ready to move, that doesn't seem feasible pretty much anywhere in any urbanized center. But yeah, we definitely want people. We definitely have lots of people who are trying to enter the market, but you run into these problems like, okay, we're building a lot of things, but we're not building family-sized units for condos, right? We're building bachelor pads, we're building single bedroom things.
I guess that's kind of the point that we've been trying to make on this podcast, especially coming off this provincial election where there's talk of, we need to build more, we need to put more stuff on the market. And there's something that Roll and I kind of noticed was that, yeah, they say the free market will provide, but it really isn't, because the options to buy on the free market is pretty much just like bachelor pad, 1 or 2 bedroom condo unit, or sprawling McMansion out here in the 905. Like it's like, well, what about in between? Like, yes. why are those our only 2 options, or the only 2 things on the market that I can forget affording? It's just, that's my option to buy. Right. And I thought, like, there's so much space in between that we should be looking at that as to tell the market, this is what we want you to provide for.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've been covering this kind of thing for about 7 years, and I remember starting out and going to like conventions and hearing people speak, like, city planners, that kind of thing, and the buzzwords were infill, missing middle, all those things that we still talk about, but the sense that I get, and again, this is not my expertise, but like between developers and politicians and people in community groups, it seems there's a confluence of things that keep that from actually happening in a lot of places. But if you ask an urban planner, they'll still say things like, urban infill, that kind of thing. A parking lot could be sort of mid-rise housing, or multi-tenant, without without getting the neighbors out in with pitchforks and things about the the level of density or the height of it. So
when we were just discussing what we talked about today, we were I kind of wrote the sentence just in the text I was sending you, like, how do we, in the 905 to we have everybody's agreed that they don't want sprawl. But the problem with that is that everybody's also agreed that they don't want high rise, and people aren't that keen on missing middle infill either.
Right.
So, given that basically everything is unpopular, how do we sell that? And I wonder if the ultimate problem is not so much that people are by their natures small c conservative, that people tend to move to an area because they like that neighborhood how it is right now, and it's almost a normal, natural human emotion to say, no, I don't want it to change. I wouldn't have come here if I wanted it to be different. But the real problem is it's just the way that our local democracy works or doesn't work. Just at every direction kind of creates barriers to intelligent negotiation over how cities evolve and grow. So instead of, it always boils down to a battle of wills, basically, between no change and huge change, rather than a kind of negotiated, okay, what can everybody live with? Is that, I mean, and it comes back to the OLT and all these things. Is that your kind of take as well? That it's almost like the problem is so huge. It's not just that, you know, we all agree kind of on what needs to happen. It's just how we get there is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'd be interested as well to hear. I'd be interested to hear both of your perspective as well, because in Toronto, I tend to take a bit of a hard line on things like, oh, I don't want it too dense, I don't want it too high. I'm like, you live in the fourth largest city in North America.
Mhm.
If you, I used to say, you know, if you don't like that, there are other places you could go and live, and where you can find that sort of suburban, you know, white picket fence sort of neighborhood that you seem to want. But you know, I understand that, like, 905, it's not just sleepy bedroom communities anymore. They're
Well,
giant cities.
see, I think there's a disconnect there, because that's how you view the 905. There are many people here in the 905 that view us as small towns. Like
Yeah.
and I mean, if you drive through Mississauga is basically a collection of small towns that were amalgamated back in the day into Mississauga. But I would argue that if you lived in one of those towns, you never really grew out of that identity as, you know, Streetsville or Cooksville or Port Credit or wherever. You say you're in Mississauga because that's where the mail has to be delivered there. They'll say you're in Mississauga, but you never really grew out of it. Here in Burlington, I know there are people who view it as, oh, it's a city with the little town feel. And I'm thinking that that's more of a detriment to Burlington more and more, as you say, like, we're growing. We're you know, there's 5 million people living here in the 905. And they need a place to live. Now, either we say flatten the green belt and just keep producing sprawl and cookie cutter subdivisions, which I don't think people want, or we have to start building up. Now, for some reason, the debate is always between, like, oh, we don't want to look like downtown Toronto. I'm like, okay, fair enough, but it's got to be, again, somewhere in the middle that we can all live with.
Well, yeah, my feeling is, so, you know, again, coming back to when I ran for election, the whole election in Burlington in 2018 was about downtown building heights, basically. I mean, described it as intensification, but when you went and knocked on the door, it was like, I hate the high rises, and that was, to say that was an overwhelming thing that you heard at the doors is an understatement. It was just like 85%, 85, 90%. It was just, okay, what do you care about this election? I hate the downtown height. Now, I was running in the downtown ward as well, so, but it was, you know, my kind of feeling was, I can't run as a candidate and say that 90% of my electorate are NIMBYs who don't know what they're talking about. I can't do that. I have to accept and respect their point of view. And, you know, my feeling was then, and I think, you know, there would be a lot of agreement. There's this, like, well, we kind of behave like there's only 2 places you can build. One is downtown, which is a very small area in any city ultimately, and the other area is out in the green fields and everything in between, which brings us to the single family home neighborhoods, obviously, and opening up those areas for growth, where, you know, they are completely off limits in the way that our zoning currently works.
Yeah,
I mean, I think there are a lot of answers there. It's just that I'm also not stupid enough to think that if you know, the recent housing task force that the PCs had, you know, their proposed sort of cure was, you know, at the first reading, I was like, oh yeah, this is really interesting, this is great. And then on the second reading, it's like, you're saying that as of right, anywhere you can go to, was it 6 stories, 8 stories? I can't remember how many stories were. And it was just like, it's not so much that I think that's necessarily wrong, so much as I think it's a recipe for political disaster, that that there has to be some kind of, like, either an area has complete power and can basically veto any change, which is what the current situation with single family home neighborhoods, or no power at all, and the developers have all and can build what the hell they want. It's like, well, neither of those extremes seems like the right solution to me. There should be negotiation and agreement over, but no one should have the right to say no or yes to ultimately this is a democratic problem and not a problem about what should happen. It's how we negotiate how things are done in a less confrontational way. I don't know if you're following what I'm saying there, but
yeah, I think so. When I think of what you're talking about, Doug Ford government's style is constantly in various different ways trying to sort of end run local authority, all over Ontario. I think the problem with that, a lot of my urbanist colleagues celebrated that because they were so sick of seeing decent proposals get shouted down at the whatever various community committees, and just being frustrated with how are we ever going to get the appropriate amount of density when the loudest voices in the room are always fighting any kind of density or change like that. But the thing is, when you end run the local power, it's not going to be the MPPs that are going to have to deal with whatever the fallout is or help make that work in practice. It's going to be at the local level. And I think a lot of people won't understand or appreciate the differences in the levels of government. These councillors, wherever. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, just on that note, it doesn't help when local councillors run on being the change candidate and saying, "Oh, I'm going to prevent all the high rises from being built downtown," or "I'm going to, we're going to stop all the new development and freeze it in its tracks." And you realize, well, you don't have any power to actually do that.
Yeah. Even if they should, which probably, that's a
conversation. That's a different argument altogether. But I mean, I know a lot of candidates used to run on that, saying, "Oh, I'm going to stop it. I'm going to stop that development, and we're going to take back control of development." And 4 years later, you haven't taken back anything.
Yeah. But in terms of, Roland, what you were saying about like getting people on board, like the average, citizens, I don't think that the right tactic is to say like, "Hey, you're an idiotic NIMBY and you don't care about the future. You don't care about any other people." I think there are different kinds of cases you can make depending on what kind of voter they are. Like you can explain that, sprawl leads to a lot more, it's expensive. Sprawl is expensive. You got to put down that much more infrastructure. You got to build further and further out. And they will see that difference if they care about that line on their tax bill. And then, other more compelling things is like, we know that these single family neighborhoods don't really work very well anymore. They don't represent, family size or what people are looking for, or people who don't want to, have to age out of the community that they spent 30 years in. But there's no services nearby, and they can't drive themselves around like they used to. There's a bunch of things like Cheryl Case is brilliant, and she's written quite extensively about just why those single family neighborhoods just don't really serve anyone, even the people that say they like them.
Yeah, I totally I'm totally get on board with that, particularly in the world where we're working more from home. I know, I mean, I've worked from home since 2000, actually most of my life from one place or another I've worked from home.
Yeah.
And when I was looking at buying a house 10, 15 years ago, or whatever, it's like, well, I don't want to, a lot of these single family home neighbors are just boring wastelands. That's just to live there and walk the dog is boring. So, I mean, I did buy somewhere in a single family home neighborhood, but it was within walking distance of somewhere with restaurants, right. And, now, lucky me that I was able to do that. But yeah, I mean, we've done the whole of North American culture has done an amazing marketing job on selling people and living in a little patch of land with nothing near it, which is a strange kind of thing, really. But it brings me back to that, just the extent to which the problem is so vast when we talk about selling this to society, when people just, like you say, I mean, explain to people the cost of sprawl, the basic dollar value of it, but also the cost in terms of the environment, in terms of so many other things. But it seems like we're not even at the beginning of that conversation in so many ways.
But I'd say we kind of are, because like this, I've been looking at this last election. Everyone was talking about we need to build more. We need to throw open the doors to build more supply to meet the housing demand, right or wrong. And I thought that's an excellent opportunity for people to say, okay, but you have to build what we want to buy. And the question is, what do you want to buy? Now, the developers, again, it kind of comes back to my previous point. The developers will say, oh, people want to buy these single family detached homes in neighborhoods, and therefore we have to build into the greenbelt because that's the only place to build. I would argue, like, what should we be arguing for? Because I think people understand we need different. We need something not there if we don't want to build into the greenbelt. And Glyn, as somebody who's kind of been watching this for the last few years, like, what would be the ideal shift towards that maybe people should start demanding more of development and city councils to start approving for?
Well,
Pie in the sky.
Early day. Pie in the sky. Like, this is early days. It remains to be seen, like, how this turns out. But I brought a 905 example. I think the plan for 20-minute walkable communities in Brampton is that's exactly the type of thing that 905 cities should be looking at and building, and it's the kind of design that makes you love living in the city in its own right. That it's not just a satellite community. That, like, hey, Brampton is its own thing. It's got everything you need to, like, live, work, and play. And as all of these cities increase in population, I think starting to plan for that now is going to become important. And Roland, you mentioned the pandemic. I wonder what influence that had on people who maybe considered where they lived like a bedroom community when they couldn't go downtown for work, and they were stuck in their neighborhoods. I would like to think that influenced a lot of people to say, like, hey, we've got to make these livable neighborhoods in their own right, and not just a place to, like, lay your head at the end of the day.
And I mean, it's something we certainly talked about. And again, we're kind of disappointed in all the parties that they haven't caught onto this, of the kind of, okay, there's a huge negative with the pandemic, but there was also a huge positive, and that we were spending less time commuting and sitting in offices in front of a computer, when it's like, well, I've got a computer at home. Why am I driving to a different computer?
No.
And you would think, I don't quite understand why the parties weren't kind of embracing that and saying, look, we can do everything by, we can do so many things via Zoom now. This is a good thing. This means you've got all this extra time to walk from your home to the downtown restaurant on a Wednesday evening and have a glass of wine with friends or a meal or whatever. And have, a vastly better quality of life because we spend more of it in our homes. And if you live in a vibrant, walkable city, then your quality of life can be vastly better than your parents was, who just hacked in and out of Toronto 5 days a week. And the fact that so much of the election and the kind of political discourse is about getting back to normal. It's like, well, normal sucked.
Yeah.
Why do we bring it back to normal?
Yeah. I mean, I share your disappointment in that election. I truly don't know what it was about. It's we're 2 weeks out from it, and I don't know what it was about, but it was not about urban living or anything that concerns the three of us beyond what, as Joel said, just like, we've got to build something, we got to build more, but like, we never got into any specifics. I think every party had something like, we're going to build this many houses, or we're going to do this or that, but the numbers that they were talking about were negligible. Yeah.
I mean, again, obviously coming from Europe,
never really got into the what's that?
Yeah. Well, coming from Europe, I mean, I grew up surrounded by council housing. I mean, and council housing often would have a bad reputation, but the vast majority of it was excellent, affordable housing built and maintained by municipalities that it's desirable enough now that when the Conservative government tried to sell it off, I mean, those houses sell and, now have secondary, and it's like, why does North America never consider this, that kind of mass municipal housing is an option?
It's because it got associated with poor people. That's it got associated with poor people, and I'll be honest, with racialized poor people. And that's just people have in their heads. If you say I'm going to build this neighborhood will be socialized housing, we'll give it all over to the regional housing corporation, whatever you want to call it. People be up in arms because say, I don't want to live next to poor people. For example, perfect note here. When I bought my house, there's a co-op of townhomes just around the corner of where I live. And my realtor, who was telling us, like, you do know that there's a co-op around the corner from me. Like it's full of, poor people. And we're like, I don't care. The house is great. It's in a neighborhood that we can afford, and it's kind of what we want. And we can plug into the great schools and what have you. Been living here for 10 plus years now. Haven't looked back. It's a great neighborhood. But again, it's that we're not building because we have so many fears about, well, if we allow buildings over a certain density or a certain height, we're going to turn in. The option is now just going to turn in Toronto. That's it. If we allow social housing to be built near us, poor people are going to be, and that'll bring down my property values, and I can't trust poor people. And so, we're so caught up in our fears that we're not really talking about what's the kind of the community that we could have.
Yeah.
And I might be pie in the sky. Maybe I'm looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, but the current arguments just mean, I think, the same problems just down the road.
I always come back to this kind of the shortcomings in our democracy mean that the decisions we make when we have elections are distorted and oversimplified. Like, people are capable of making pretty complex and advanced decisions at elections when they understand the full implications. I mean, we during the sort of 80s and 90s, people were voting on the basis, I mean, we may not have had the result you wanted, whatever, but it was, people are making judgments on levels of national debt, and it's like, okay, if we vote for this, it's going to imply slightly higher taxes or whatever, but we're willing to support that because of the other things that come along with. So people can make fairly advanced decisions, but with our municipal decision making, which is the stuff that touches us every day, we're just talking about the most. We're talking almost at a kind of childish level of superficiality. Even compared with a federal election, which is maybe not as good as it should be, but and it's because we're not informed. And also, I mean, I also tend to think is that because of the system we have where municipal councillors and mayors are fully independent, that means that as a candidate, I couldn't run and say, I'm going to do this. I think because it's like, well, no, I'm one voice. If I get elected, who knows what I can do? It would depend on all the other guys who get elected. Now I could take the traditional route and just lie to people and say, this is what I'm going to do. Or I could try and be slightly more honest and say, well, this is what I'd like to do. I don't know. I mean, to what extent do you think that the underlying all this is the kind of democratic deficit that operates when everything to do with kind of municipal level decision making?
Well, absolutely. And, what you could do as a candidate, what I hope to see from candidates all over Ontario as we all go to the municipal elections is, just take a kind of rising tides raises all boats approach where, as a candidate, a local candidate, your job isn't just to get elected. You are also selling like why local democracy is important. I'd like to see that from a lot of candidates. Obviously, there are some grizzled old incumbents who have always been there, and they probably always will be there, and they, they're not incentivized to change anything or inspire anyone, or they're just trying to win their seat back. But I'm hoping to see all over the GTA a lot of candidates who, when they go door knocking, explain why this matters, because I think a lot of regular people just see it as that's the big building where my tax checks go.
Yeah. I mean, I think people, the level of respect for municipal. I mean, sometimes when you look at Hamilton, for very good reason, there's a reason why there's not much respect, but at the same time, it is so important. I mean, that's probably a good way to wrap up this conversation. But looking ahead to October, also you're probably most familiar with the ins and outs of Toronto, and we're not. But what do you think? What are you expecting to see in the kind of Toronto election this year?
Well, we've already seen a lot of longtime councillors stepping down, moving on to other things. Some of them have already left. Kristen Wong-Tam is now a provincial politician. Michael Ford is also now a provincial politician. Etobicoke's loss, I suppose. But that's exciting, because a total power vacuum can sometimes be an opportunity for fresh ideas. And now there are unofficial political parties in the background that will try and just install their person as a replacement. I'm hopefully, I would really like to see a lot of fresh faces, fresh new ideas, and a little bit of fearlessness about just exactly what we should demand of the places that we live.
It's just something, just a question I've asked a few people over the years about the cities that were amalgamated back in the Harris era. Obviously, Toronto's one of those, Hamilton's another one. And when I look at Hamilton's current politics, it seems to be still very much about problems that came out of amalgamation. The old urban Hamilton and new rural and suburban Hamilton just don't really see things the same way. And kind of resent each other because of that, and the suburban area thinks that the downtown is why their taxes are so high, and vice versa. Do you think? I mean, it's not on the radar, and it's not going to happen. But do you think there would actually be a case for de-amalgamation in places like Toronto and Hamilton?
I mean, it pops up every time we have some kind of argument about a subway or this and that, and the former Mayor Rob Ford actively tried to exploit that divide to I would think generationally damaging effect. But personally, I've only known an amalgamated Toronto. I'm not interested in having a serious conversation about de-amalgamating, because the city's just going to grow and grow, and these old lines on the map are going to make less and less sense. What I would love to see is smaller ward sizes once again. As some of your listeners may know, we got our number of wards slashed in half, and now you have one councillor representing something bonkers like 100,000 people. So I think more local, more ability at the local level to reach out to individual constituents would be good.
I'm wondering this. Do you think this year might be a bit of a check and balance against the provincial government from the municipal level? It's something we've always puzzled at, is the city councils in the 905 all complain that they don't have enough control, enough power over their own decision-making process. And they saw what happened with Toronto as a warning. This could happen to us in some form or another. Would it make sense for the city councils around the 905 to maybe start pooling together and start taking a firmer stand against Queen's Park and saying, no, we aren't going to stand for this, and you can legislate it out of existence, but if you are, then you take on the ownership of these decisions. Like because we keep hearing, Burlington or Hamilton or Mississauga, Brampton, Newmarket, all saying, "Oh, we want control over this process. We want control over how our cities are developed on our own terms." And yet they're still fighting one-on-one battles with Queen's Park. Yet they all want the same thing. And maybe it's time that they kind of start pooling together and start actively saying, "Hey, no, we're not. This is the line in the sand. We're not crossing it."
If I was a political strategist, I would say that something I've noticed about Doug Ford is he really does not like to be the one with whom the buck stops.
Right.
So I guess you could put pressure on at the local level, like cities, mayors and council could put pressure on saying like, "Hey, if you want to be in charge of this, go ahead. But like you break it, you bought it."
Right.
And really lay whatever the outcome is at his feet, because he does not like that. And he does not like to wear the kind of fallouts from the control that he insists on having in the first place.
I really feel it's something, and we spoke to the mayor of Newmarket a couple of months ago, and I know, well, a point he made that I would also make is that, so often the municipal politicians are taking the heat for decisions that are ultimately made provincially, because we have this kind of facade of municipal decision making where a councillor will sit down and vote on a development, and then it's appealed or whatever, or the provincial rules state that X has to happen. Well, the poor schmuck in the council chamber in, let's pick Oakville at random so I don't offend anybody I know particularly well.
Okay.
They take the heat for it come elections. Why have you let this happen? And it's like, well, I didn't let it happen. I had no choice, and that seems wrong somehow. That either you have real local democracy or you don't, and that I feel that it's like let's just get rid of this game. If the decisions are basically dictated at a provincial level, then let the province take the rap as well, and that's fair, But anyway, I mean, we're approaching, well, more than approached the reasonable time limit on our episodes, so we should probably wrap it up there. Thanks so much, Glyn Bowerman, for joining us today, and we'll include links to the spacing.ca website and Spacing Magazine, and of course the Spacing Radio podcast as well in the show notes, and thoroughly encourage all our listeners to go and check that out and everything that Spacing does. It's a great entity. So thanks, Glyn, for joining us today.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
You looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.